Have you ever noticed how certain people seem to provoke a disproportionate reaction in the groups around them, even when they only express simple truths or ask honest questions? There is something almost magnetic in this dynamic. A person presents a lucid observation about reality, speaks with authenticity about something everyone feels deep down but no one dares to mention, and suddenly the environment transforms. Expressions change, discomfort spreads like an invisible wave. Some avert their gaze, others try to change the subject or respond with surprising hostility. This pattern repeats itself in families, companies, religions, entire nations. And it may seem confusing at first glance, but there is a deep reason why conscious people bother the social structures around them so much. And this reason reveals something fundamental about our human nature and the fragility of the illusions that sustain our social world. During most of our evolutionary history, human survival depended on group cohesion. The isolated individual was extremely vulnerable on the African savanna, while the group offered protection, shared resources, accumulated knowledge. This dependence on the group shaped not only our social structures, but our own psychology. We developed an extraordinary capacity to absorb collective narratives, to synchronize our behaviors and beliefs with those around us, to feel and respond to the expectations of the group. This capacity was literally a matter of life or death for our ancestors. The individual who could not fit in, who questioned the tribe's beliefs too much, who noticed contradictions in sacred rituals, represented a threat to group cohesion and often paid a high price for their expanded consciousness. What we are seeing when we observe a group's defensive reaction against a conscious individual is a deeply encoded evolutionary response. It is not just superficial discomfort, but a self-preservation reaction of what we might call the collective ego. Just as the individual ego protects our self-image and rejects information that threatens our personal identity, the collective ego of a group protects the shared self-image and rejects any information or person that threatens the common narrative that keeps the group united. All human societies are grounded in shared fictions, in myths that give meaning and direction to our large-scale cooperation. These are not necessarily conscious lies, but social constructions that we treat as objective realities. The value of money, the authority of the state, the importance of academic titles, corporate hierarchies, national identities, religious dogmas, gender expectations, all these are examples of shared fictions that gained power because we collectively believe in them. And it is important to note that there is nothing inherently wrong with these fictions. They are evolutionary tools that allowed human cooperation on unprecedented scales in the animal kingdom. But the price of this adaptive success is that we rarely critically examine these narratives, rarely see how much of our social reality is constructed and sustained only by our collective agreement. The conscious person disrupts this dynamic. They see the seams of social reality. They notice that the king is naked. They recognize that many of our most sacred truths are conventions, not immutable facts of nature. And when that person expresses what they see, even gently, they threaten the stability of the psychic energy field that keeps the group together. For many in the group, this is a deeply disorienting and threatening experience. Imagine building your entire identity, your entire sense of purpose and security around certain unquestionable truths, only to have someone show that those truths are contingent social constructions, that they could be different, that perhaps they are outdated or serving hidden interests. This revelation threatens not only their beliefs, but their own identity and sense of reality. Throughout human history, we see how societies deal with these individuals who threaten the collective ego. Socrates was forced to drink hemlock for corrupting the youth of Athens with his persistent questions. Galileo was placed under house arrest for challenging the church's geocentric narrative. Countless dissidents, reformers, and visionaries have been silenced, exiled, or eliminated because their perceptions represented a threat to the dominant narrative. And this is not just a dynamic of large societies or institutions. The same reaction occurs in dysfunctional families, where the child who names the parents' alcoholism or patterns of abuse is labeled as problematic and rebellious. It happens in companies, where the employee who questions unethical practices is marginalized as not being a team player. It happens in intimate relationships, where the person seeking more authenticity and growth often meets resistance from the partner who prefers to maintain the comfortable status quo. What makes this dynamic particularly interesting in our current historical moment is that we are witnessing an unprecedented phenomenon, a simultaneous awakening of consciousness on a global scale. Through the internet, mass education, exposure to diverse cultures and ideas, millions of people are beginning to question narratives that were once accepted without reflection. They are seeing social, economic, and political structures not as natural and inevitable arrangements, but as human constructions that can be re-evaluated and reshaped. And this collective awakening is putting extraordinary pressure on the collective egos of our major institutions. Have you noticed how traditional institutions seem to be in an existential crisis in recent years? Organized religions, governments, corporations, educational systems, traditional family structures, all are facing unprecedented questioning about their legitimacy and relevance. It is no coincidence that we are also seeing increasingly extreme defensive reactions. The growth of authoritarian movements, the renewed religious fanaticism, extreme political polarization, the proliferation of conspiracy theories, the return to rigid tribal identities, all of these can be understood as defensive responses of collective egos under threat. When a collective ego is questioned, its first reaction is rarely self-reflection and adaptation. Instead, like the individual ego, it often responds with denial, projection, anger, and even deeper entrenchment in its existing beliefs. We see this in religious groups that, confronted with criticism or rational questioning, often become more dogmatic, not less. We see this in nations that, faced with challenges to their historical self-image, often resort to more fervent nationalism. We see this in families where, when one member begins to question dysfunctional dynamics, the family often unites against that person rather than examine its problematic patterns. The collective ego, like the individual, prefers coherence over truth. It prefers simple and comforting narratives that reaffirm its positive self-image, even if those narratives require significant distortion of reality. And it is precisely this dynamic that makes conscious people so deeply uncomfortable. They are involuntary mirrors that reflect the contradictions, the hypocrisies, the shadows that the collective ego works so hard to deny or hide. Modern technology has dramatically intensified this tension between individual consciousness and collective ego. On one hand, we have never had so much access to information, so many opportunities to question dominant narratives, so many platforms to express alternative perspectives. On the other hand, the same technology is being used to reinforce ideological bubbles, to manipulate emotions and beliefs on a massive scale, to increase surveillance and social control. We are in an evolutionary race between forces of awakening consciousness and forces of control and conformity, and the outcome remains uncertain. Artificial intelligence represents the next chapter in this story, with profound implications for the balance between individual consciousness and collective ego. These technologies have the potential to dramatically expand our consciousness, giving us access to information and perspectives that transcend our individual limitations. But they also have the potential to become the most sophisticated tools ever created for social manipulation and control. Imagine algorithms capable of predicting exactly what kind of content will reinforce your existing beliefs, that can personalize political propaganda with millimetric precision, that can identify and neutralize problematic individuals even before they have a significant impact on the group. We are already seeing outlines of this future: social credit systems in China, corporate employee surveillance, predictive analysis of social risks, recommendation algorithms that keep us in ideological echo chambers, all represent attempts to use technology to strengthen the collective ego and neutralize threats to its stability. And it is important to recognize that these are not necessarily malicious conspiracies by dark elites. They are expressions of a deeply human impulse for social cohesion, predictability, and control. They are technological manifestations of the same dynamic that led primitive tribes to punish deviance and reinforce conformity. I need to stop for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this technological future we are discussing awakens your fear or apprehension the most? Do you lie in bed at night thinking about this too? I know that we often keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps for fear of appearing paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your concerns are valid and likely shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My biggest fear about our technological future is your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to face them. The fundamental challenge we face, both individually and collectively, is how to navigate this tension between consciousness and belonging. How can we cultivate greater lucidity, authenticity, and freedom without destroying the social structures that give meaning and stability to our lives? How can we question problematic and outdated narratives without creating a vacuum of meaning? How can we honor truth, even when it is uncomfortable, without losing compassion for those who are not yet ready to face it? There are no simple answers to these questions, but there are principles that can guide us. The first is to recognize that all human social structures are simultaneously real and constructed. Money, nations, corporations, religions have real and powerful effects on the world, even while being fundamentally consensual fictions. Recognizing their constructed nature does not mean denying their reality or importance, but gaining a more flexible and creative perspective on how we can reform them to better serve evolving human needs. The second principle is to cultivate what Buddhists call skillful compassion. People are not wrong for identifying with the collective ego of their group. This identification served vital evolutionary purposes and continues to satisfy deep human needs for belonging, meaning, and security. The resistance we encounter when we question collective narratives does not come from stupidity or evil, but from very real existential fear. When a person feels that their fundamental worldview is being threatened, they are in a way experiencing a small death. Recognizing this allows us to approach such situations not with superiority or impatience, but with genuine empathy. The third principle is understanding that expanded consciousness is not a final state to be reached, but a continuous process with no final destination. No matter how conscious we become, there will always be illusions we cannot see, narratives we accept without questioning, aspects of reality that remain beyond our understanding. This epistemic humility protects us from the trap of simply replacing one dogma with another, of trading old certainties for new ones, just as rigid. The fourth principle is recognizing that the awakening of consciousness occurs in a spiral, not in a straight line. There will be moments when we need to distance ourselves from social structures to gain critical perspective, and moments when we need to re-engage with those structures to effect meaningful change. There will be periods of radical deconstruction where we question fundamental assumptions, and periods of reconstruction where we create new narratives and structures that incorporate deeper truths. This is not a linear process, but a dynamic and continuous cycle. One of the most interesting aspects of human history is how ideas and individuals who were initially rejected as threats to the collective ego often end up being integrated and celebrated by the very structures that once resisted them. Galileo was condemned by the church, but his insights were eventually incorporated into Christian cosmology without destroying the faith. Martin Luther King Jr. was seen as a dangerous agitator by many white Americans, but is now celebrated as a national hero. Feminist ideas that were considered radical a century ago are now widely accepted as common sense. This gives us hope that the collective ego, despite its initial resistance to change, possesses a remarkable capacity for evolution and integration. Perhaps the greatest challenge of our era is how to facilitate this process of collective consciousness evolution in ways that minimize trauma and maximize genuine growth. How can we create safe spaces where individuals and groups can question their fundamental narratives without feeling that their identity is under existential attack? How can we present new perspectives in ways that invite curiosity instead of defensiveness? How can we honor the value of belonging and collective meaning while also honoring the pursuit of truth and authenticity? There are no definitive maps for this territory, but we are beginning to see promising experiments, communities of practice that combine meditation with social engagement, companies that are reimagining their structures to allow more authenticity and autonomy while maintaining shared purpose, religious movements that find ways to honor tradition while opening themselves to evolving consciousness, technological platforms designed to promote understanding between divergent perspectives rather than polarization. These are living laboratories for a new integration between individual consciousness and collective cohesion. A consistent pattern we see in these successful experiments is the shift from identity based on content to identity based on consciousness. When a group defines its identity primarily by the content of its beliefs, what we think, it will naturally feel threatened when those beliefs are questioned. But when a group defines its identity more by the process of its collective inquiry, how we think together, it can remain cohesive even as its understandings evolve. This is a subtle but profound shift in the foundation of the collective ego, making it far more adaptable and resilient in the face of new information and perspectives. Another promising pattern is the recognition of the importance of ritual and myth, even in communities dedicated to rationality and objective truth. Humans are not purely rational creatures, and even the most lucid objective analyses of reality do not fully meet our needs for meaning, beauty, and transcendent connection. Communities that can simultaneously honor our need for truth and our longing for meaning seem more capable of navigating the tension between individual consciousness and collective belonging. Perhaps the most hopeful aspect of our current situation is that for the first time in human history, we are developing a meta-systematic understanding of how belief systems and collective egos function. We are not only questioning specific beliefs within our systems, but understanding the nature and dynamics of the belief systems themselves. This higher order perspective gives us an unprecedented capacity to consciously evolve our social structures rather than simply being unconsciously shaped by them. When we look at the evolutionary journey of human consciousness, from hunter-gatherer tribes to interconnected global civilizations, we can see a consistent pattern of expanding circles of empathy and understanding, from primary identification with the immediate family, to the clan, to the tribe, to the nation, to humanity as a whole, and now potentially to all sentient beings. Each expansion of this circle faced fierce resistance from existing collective egos. Each step brought new capacities for cooperation and growth, but also new challenges and possibilities for abuse. And at every stage, individuals who saw beyond conventional identity boundaries were initially perceived as threats, only later to be recognized as pioneers of a more expanded consciousness. We are now on the threshold of a potentially unprecedented expansion of human consciousness. The combination of globalization, digital technology, ecological crisis, and spiritual development is creating conditions for a fundamental re-examination of who we are and how we relate to one another and to the planet we share. This is a moment of enormous potential and also enormous risk. The risk comes from the possibility that collective egos under threat respond with increasingly extreme measures to maintain control and coherence. We already see disturbing signs of this pattern in the rise of authoritarianism, the intensification of tribal conflicts, the proliferation of disinformation and manipulation on an industrial scale. When collective egos feel existentially threatened, they may resort to desperate measures, including violence, to preserve their integrity. The potential comes from the possibility of a wiser integration between individual consciousness and collective belonging. Imagine societies where personal authenticity is valued alongside the common good, where social structures are understood as provisional tools for human flourishing, not absolute truths to be defended at all costs, where respectful disagreement is seen as a path to deeper understanding, not a threat to be suppressed, where our capacity for shared narratives is consciously directed toward creating stories that encourage our wisdom and compassion, not our fears and prejudices. The deep irony of this situation is that the same human capacity that allows us to create and sustain shared social fictions is the capacity that now allows us to recognize their constructed nature, our extraordinary ability for symbolic creativity and cooperation based on shared stories is both the source of the collective ego and the resource that now allows us to transcend it. This is an expression of the fundamental paradox at the heart of the human condition. The same qualities that create our limitations are the ones that allow us to recognize and potentially move beyond them. For the individual who has already awakened to a more expanded consciousness, who already sees social structures as constructions rather than absolute realities, the path ahead is not easy. You will often be misunderstood. You will face resistance, sometimes fierce, from people and systems who feel their identity threatened by your clarity. You will be tempted to retreat into the comfort of conformity or to isolate yourself completely from the social structures that seem so rooted in illusion. Wisdom lies in finding a third path. Neither unconscious conformity nor total rejection, but conscious engagement with social structures as they exist while patiently working for their evolution. It is like the metaphor of the carpenter who gradually replaces the planks of a boat while remaining at sea. We cannot jump out of society to rebuild it from scratch, nor can we simply accept its current limitations. Instead, we work from within, replacing one element at a time, preserving what is valuable while transforming what no longer serves. For those still deeply identified with particular collective egos, whether religious, political, national, or cultural, the message is not that you must abruptly abandon these structures of meaning. These identifications serve important purposes and cannot simply be discarded without serious consequences. Instead, the invitation is toward a more conscious and flexible relationship with these collective identities, to recognize that they are tools for our human journey, not final destinations or absolute truths. Perhaps the most useful metaphor for understanding this dynamic comes from child development. A young child initially does not distinguish between itself and its mother. Gradually, it develops a sense of separate self, but remains completely dependent on parental care. As it grows, it develops more autonomy, often testing limits and questioning parental authority. In adolescence, this tension between independence and belonging often reaches a critical point with open rebellion against family norms. But healthy development does not end in complete rejection of the family. Instead, it leads to a new integration where the now adult individual can maintain meaningful family connections while also maintaining autonomy and authenticity. Similarly, our relationship with collective egos can evolve from unconscious identification to rebellious rejection to eventual mature integration, an integration where we can participate in social systems, contribute to them, even enjoy the benefits they provide, without confusing them with absolute realities or allowing them to define the limits of our consciousness. And just as healthy child development requires caregivers who can tolerate and support the child's growing individualization without retaliation or abandonment, healthy social development requires institutions and communities that can tolerate and even encourage the questioning and evolution of their members without responding with rejection or punishment. The most resilient and vibrant social groups are not those that demand strict conformity, but those that can accommodate genuine diversity of perspectives while maintaining a sense of shared purpose and identity. If these reflections touched something you have been feeling, but perhaps have not found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us in this continuing journey. Subscribe so that we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. Observing the trajectory of consciousness evolution throughout human history, it is easy to fall into linear thinking and imagine that we are on a one-directional journey from the tribal to the global, from the mythical to the rational, from the collective to the individual. But reality is more complex and interesting. What we are seeing is not the complete abandonment of earlier modes of consciousness, but a more complex integration of them. We are not leaving behind the human need for belonging, shared rituals, stories that give meaning to our existence. We are potentially finding ways to satisfy these needs that are simultaneously more conscious and more inclusive. When we look at the wisdom traditions of cultures around the world, we often find a similar pattern. The deepest traditions do not completely reject the mythology, ritual, and shared identity that characterize conventional religion. Instead, they reinterpret these elements, finding more subtle and universal meanings within the particular forms of their traditions. Christian mystics, Islamic Sufis, Hindu Vedantists, and Buddhist Dzogchen practitioners often discover remarkably convergent insights, even while continuing to express themselves in the distinct languages and practices of their respective traditions. This suggests the possibility of a future where we do not completely abandon the collective egos that gave meaning and structure to our lives, but rather transform them to accommodate more expansive levels of consciousness, where our collective identifications are held more lightly as cultural expressions of more universal truths, where belonging to a group does not require denying our shared humanity or objective reality. This is the true evolutionary potential of our current moment. It is important to recognize that throughout all of human history, the relationship between individual consciousness and collective ego has never been simply antagonistic. It is a dialectical dance where each pole continuously transforms and is transformed by the other. Individuals with expanded consciousness often create new forms of community that incorporate their realizations. These communities then offer the context for more individuals to awaken, some of whom eventually transcend even the new paradigms, initiating the cycle again. Through this process, both individual consciousness and collective structures evolve together, each encouraging the other toward greater levels of complexity, inclusion, and wisdom. At the heart of this evolution lies a paradoxical truth. True autonomy is not found in rejecting all social influences, but in the ability to relate to them consciously. The most free person is not the one who has never been shaped by culture, tradition, or community, but the one who can recognize and integrate these influences without being unconsciously controlled by them. Likewise, the healthiest community is not the one that is never challenged or questioned by its members, but the one that can incorporate and grow through these challenges without losing its essential purpose or cohesion. Thus, when we speak about conscious people disturbing the collective ego, we are not describing a battle where one side must completely defeat the other. We are describing an evolutionary process where both can potentially transform into something more integrated and complete. The awakened individual does not need to destroy social structures to be free. He needs to relate to them with greater consciousness and intentionality. And social structures do not need to suppress individual consciousness to maintain cohesion. They can evolve to accommodate and even cultivate greater autonomy and authenticity. This process is neither easy nor guaranteed. There is ample historical evidence of collective egos fiercely resisting change, sometimes with tragic consequences. And there is also evidence of awakening consciousness leading to unproductive social disengagement or nihilism. There is no simple formula for navigating these complex waters, but there is a growing understanding that our survival and flourishing as a species may depend on our ability to find this dynamic balance between authentic personal identity and meaningful social connection. As each of us navigates our personal journey through these tensions, we can remember that expanded consciousness is not a personal achievement to separate us from others, but a deeper capacity for engagement with all of reality, including our social relationships. And that collective egos, however problematic some of their aspects may be, represent our deep human need for shared meaning and belonging. honoring both these dimensions of our humanity is not weakness or compromise, but the true wisdom that our times demand. Perhaps the true test for any of us who awakens to a more expansive consciousness is not how completely we can free ourselves from social illusions, but how compassionately we can relate to those who are still deeply identified with them. And the true test for our social structures is not how effectively they can maintain uniformity of thought, but how gracefully they can accommodate and integrate emerging perspectives without losing their center. In this ongoing dialogue between the individual and the collective, we find not only the central drama of human history, but the most fertile ground for our continued evolution as a species.
I don't think it's possible to predict the future, but thinking about the future makes it possible to reflect on the meaning of what is happening right now, of the choices, the decisions we make right now, because many of these choices will have an effect for decades, maybe centuries to come. The present cannot be understood separately from the past, but neither can be understood separately from the future.
One of the key problems I see today in the world is that you have an extremely cynical view of humans and of human societies spreading both on the right but also on the left. They say that the only reality is power, that all social interactions, all human interactions are actually power struggles, that all human institutions are just conspiracies to gain power, that journalists, scientists, historians, judges, politicians, these are just conspiracies to gain power. Whenever somebody tells you something, you shouldn't ask, is it true? Because nobody cares about the truth. This is naive. They would tell you, no, this is a power play.
Who benefits?
Who benefits? Yeah. Whose privileges are being served? Whose interests are being served? This is something that Donald Trump agreed with Karl Marx, at least on that everything is just a power struggle. And if you think like that, all trust collapses, and the only thing that is left standing, that can remain standing, is a dictatorship. This is not just extremely cynical, this is just wrong. People are not these power-crazy demons.
Hello, Yuval. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
This is
good to be here.
A real pleasure to be here with Yuval. He is not only a great historian, as you all know, he is a very kind man. In the green room, among his many duties, signing books, answering my questions about Israeli politics, he also helped read a bedtime story to my 10-year-old, who is a huge fan of Unstoppable Us. So thank you, Yuval.
It's my pleasure.
All right, so what I want to do in this book is I want to go through some of the history, some of the stories you tell. I'm going to ask you a few questions about characters you introduce, the ideas they represent. We'll go through some of the arguments you make about history, about AI, and about democracy. And then I hope there'll be some time at the end to go through some of your apocalyptic thought experiments. Does that work?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And I have a whole series of questions, several thousand that people have sent in. I appreciate that. We'll get to those as well. First question. What is that bird?
Oh, that's a difficult question. It's a pigeon.
I mean, thank you. Oh, geez. What does the bird represent, and why is it on the cover of your book about the history of the world?
Well, for two main reasons. First of all, in Hebrew, there is no difference between a pigeon and a dove. I know that in English, in the English-speaking world, pigeons are often called rats with wings, whereas doves are thought of as these white angels of peace. But in Hebrew, they are the same. And there are no doves in the Middle East. Maybe this is why there is no peace in the Middle East. And there are only pigeons. And in the Bible, in the story of Noah and the flood, so he sends a pigeon, not a dove, to see if the flood is over. So we are now living in the midst of a flood of information. And this is kind of my pigeon being sent to see if the flood is over. And the other reason is that one of the chief characters of the book is a pigeon called Sherami, which was 100 years ago, was basically the most famous bird in the world. And I think he is still on display in the Smithsonian, not far from here. And
tell the story of Cherami, because it's actually, I think, quite important to the arguments you make in the book.
Yeah, so how did this bird become the most famous bird in the world? So during the First World War, when the American Expeditionary Force fought in northern France against the Germans, so an American battalion was caught behind German lines, surrounded by the Germans, and American artillery, which tried to provide them with cover fire, didn't know their exact location and actually dropped the artillery barrage right on the American soldiers, adding to the problems. And they tried to send runners to division headquarters to inform the commanders where the battalion actually is, but none of them could get through the German lines, so they turned to the only thing that could, which was a carrier pigeon, Cherami. And the commander wrote this tiny note on a piece of paper and attached it to the leg of the pigeon, and they released it to the air, and the pigeon flew through the German fire. It was hit several times. It lost the other leg, luckily not the leg with the note. It was shot through the breast, but it nevertheless managed to get through. And the artillery barrage was lifted, and help was sent to the right place, and the battalion, which was known as the Lost Battalion, was saved. And the pigeon, which was called Cherami, was then hailed as the bird that saved hundreds of American soldiers from death or captivity at the hands of the Germans. At least this was the story, which was repeated again and again in army communiques, in the newspapers. There are movies, there are children's books. So if you want to read a story, there is still a children's book about Cherami, the brave pigeon. A recent historical research that delved into the archives raised a lot of question marks about this whole story. First of all, it now turns out that the headquarters learned about the right location of the battalion before the pigeon arrived. And then it turned out that nobody is sure that the pigeon was actually Cherami, that it could have been a completely different pigeon. But still, the Cherami was displayed in the Smithsonian for years and became a pilgrimage site for veterans of the First World War, and was the most famous bird in the world. And this is part of what the book is about the power of information on the one hand, and about the tension between the truth and the stories we tell, and the effectiveness of stories which are not necessarily always truthful.
And that's why it caught my attention, because, as you may have heard in America, we still have some of these issues, and in fact, often with animals. And so I'm going to read a quote that one of our modern philosophers dealing with the same issue, J.D. Vance, said yesterday. If I have to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention to the suffering of the American people, then that's what I'm going to do. You are in favor of that, correct?
I'm not saying I'm in favor. I'm saying that this is what is happening throughout human history.
Yeah.
That, again, most information is not the truth. The truth is a rare and costly subset of information. If you want to write a true story, you need to invest a lot of time and effort and money, whereas fiction or fantasy, they're very cheap. You just write the first thing that comes to your mind. The truth also tends to be complicated, because reality is complicated, whereas fiction, you can make it as simple as you like it to be, and people usually prefer simple stories. And the last disadvantage of the truth is that the truth is often painful, whether on the individual level, or if you talk about, say, Israeli politics, on the national level. There are many things people don't want to know about themselves, about their nation, about the world. And fiction can be made as flattering as you would like it to be. So in a competition between something which is cheap and simple and flattering and something which is costly and complicated and sometimes painful, it's obvious who is going to win unless you give the truth some help.
This is the exact argument I made to my board yesterday while I'm trying to raise money for our fact-checking department. But let me ask you then about the question of a noble lie, because it's clear that history is determined by the people who tell the stories, which have either truth in them or they don't have truth in them. And you are not as dismissive of the idea of a noble lie as I expected you would be when I began the book. Explain in what circumstances it is okay for someone who is telling a story to not tell it exactly truthfully for the greater good of some kind.
It is impossible for a story to be an exact replica of reality. There is a famous Borges story about an empire that wants to create a totally truthful map, which will be exactly an exact representation of reality. And they end up producing a map with a scale of 1:1. Because this is the only map which will be 100% truthful and accurate and will not simplify anything, will not change anything. It will have to be a 1:1 map. And so the empire was covered by a map of the empire. And the effort of creating this empire, this map, exhausted the resources of the empire that therefore collapsed. And we are now in a similar situation to some extent. There is a crisis of representation in the world. That no representation seems good enough for us. Because no representation can actually be a 1:1 map of the world. This is simply impossible. And we are not sure what to do about it. Now, my position is that every story to some extent is fictional. Every story, you can't tell the whole truth. This is simply impossible. And there are cases that, yes, you need to simplify. As somebody who wrote, the history of the world in 500 pages, I know that sometimes you have to simplify. And fiction in itself is not necessarily bad. The rules of football or baseball, they are fictional. We invented them. It doesn't mean that they are bad. Fictional literature is not all bad. The key is that fiction should acknowledge its fictionality and not pretend to be reality. And when you think about the cultural or political implications of that, if you want to unite a large number of people, you need to use some stories, some mythologies. And this is not necessarily bad as long as you acknowledge what you're doing. So if we compare, for instance, two foundational texts of human history, if you compare the 10 Commandments and the US Constitution, so one text acknowledges its fictionality and the other doesn't. The 10 Commandments doesn't acknowledge that it emerged from human imagination. It claims to be the product of divine intelligence, to come down from heaven. And the downside of that is that it has no mechanism to admit and correct its own mistakes. And for instance, the 10 Commandments, as they were written sometime in the first millennium BCE, they endorse slavery. Many people don't think about it or don't notice it, but the 10th commandment actually endorses slavery. It says it's okay to hold slaves because the 10th commandment says that you should not covet your neighbor's field or ox or slaves, which implies that God has no problem with people holding slaves. God has a problem only if you covet the slaves of your neighbor. No, that's not okay. That will make God angry. And compare that to the US Constitution, which also, like the 10 Commandments, have served as the basis for large-scale human cooperation, for legal systems, for political systems. Whereas the Ten Commandments start with, I am your Lord God, the US Constitution starts with, we the people. We the people invented this document. We invented these laws. And therefore, because it acknowledges that it emerges from the human imagination, it's humans who wrote this document, it also acknowledged the potential that there might be mistakes in the document, and it has a mechanism to amend itself, which was eventually used to amend the US Constitution, which again initially endorsed slavery and was eventually amended to forbid, to ban slavery. Whereas with the Ten Commandments, because they claim to be just, they came down from heaven, there is no mechanism to change the text. There is no 11th commandment which tells people, well, if you don't like something in the 10th commandment, if you have a 2/3 majority, you can change the text. No, there is no mechanism.
I would think it might be possible for Pope Francis to change the Second Commandment better than the U.S. Congress could change the Second Amendment, but that's where we are. All right, let's stick with religion. I want you to tell the story that I think comes up in at least 3 very consequential parts of the book is the story of the Council of Hippo in Carthage and the consequences of selecting 1 Timothy into the New Testament instead of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Will you explain that story? I think it's a very important follow-on to what you were just saying about the power of story, and I swear to God, we'll get to AI in just a minute, but this is an important premise for that.
We can actually start with AI, which is very, very relevant to the Church Council of Carthage, which took place in what is today Tunisia in 397 CE. Because AI, one of the first big things that we saw it do, that shaping human history, is taking the power of recommendation. That if you go on social media, what you see there is the result of recommendations made by social media algorithms. And the power to recommend to people what stories to read or what videos to watch is extremely important. And one of the best examples in history for the power of recommendation is the editorial process that created the Bible in the New Testament. The people who created the New Testament are not the authors of the texts. They are the editors who decided what will be in and what will be out. Because, there was no New Testament, there was no Bible in the time of Jesus or in the time of St. Paul. They never read the Bible, it didn't exist. In the first 4 centuries of Christianity, Christians produced an enormous number and enormous variety of texts. There were stories about Christ, there were prophecies, doomsday prophecies about the apocalypse, there were letters by St. Paul, by other church leaders, there were lots of fake letters. That people wrote things in the name of St. Paul like 200 years after the man was dead. So Christian communities were again flooded by a very large number of texts, and a question arose: what should good Christians read? They needed a recommendation list. The same way that today we are flooded by TV series, and we need a recommendation list, what to watch. So in the late 4th century, a committee was set up, a church council, theologians, bishops. They met first in Hippo, in what is today, I think, Algeria, then in Carthage, in what is today Tunisia, and they hammered out a recommendation list, top 27 texts every Christian should read. And this became the New Testament. They didn't write the text. They went over, again, very large numbers of texts that existed at the time and chose what will be in and what will be out. And this shaped Christianity and the views of billions of people on numerous issues until this very day. And to give you just one example out of many, so one very popular text with Christians at the time was the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Paul is St. Paul, And Thecla was one of the most favorite saints of the time. She was a woman disciple of Paul, and she was a leader of the community. She preached, she performed miracles, she baptized, and she was hailed as an example that women can be leaders in the church. And women can preach, and women can baptize and perform miracles. So this was one popular text with one view of women. Then there was another text, a letter, allegedly from St. Paul to Timothy, which most scholars today think is a much later forgery. It was not written by St. Paul in the 1st century, probably forged in his name sometime in the 2nd century. And in this letter, a completely different view of women and their role in the church. It says that women should be obedient, should be silent, should never be leaders. They should fulfill themselves by doing whatever men tell them to do, and by having children and raising children. This is their role in life. And the committee in Carthage decided to exclude the acts of Paul and Thecla from the top 27, but to include this letter to Timothy, which is still part of the New Testament around the world, as 1 Timothy. And this has shaped the views of billions of Christians about women in the church and also in general for more than 1,500 years. This is the power of recommendation. And now this power, and this connects to AI, this is the power which is increasingly held by AI algorithms. We have now this kind of huge public debate about social media and the spread of fake news and conspiracy theories and so forth on social media. And you hear people like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg saying that we don't want to censor anybody, that this is an issue of freedom of speech. But it's not. The problem with the spread of this type of information on social media is not human users producing certain lies or fictions or fake news. The real problem is corporate algorithms deciding which stories to recommend, which stories to promote. And the power that was held by the bishops in the Council of Carthage and the power that was held by newspaper editors in recent generations, this is now the power in the hands of the social media algorithms. And this should be at the center of the debate, which we'll get to. On regulation, it's not about the freedom of speech of humans. It's about the responsibility of the corporate algorithms. Because if a corporate algorithm decides to promote a certain conspiracy, this is not on the person who invented it. This is the decision of the algorithm and the decision of its human corporate masters, and this is what should be at the center of the debate.
So what I'm hearing is if the Council of Carthage had been slightly different, women would have been empowered much sooner. We would have had a feminist revolution several centuries earlier. Probably AI would have been invented, and we all would be obliterated by now. Is that correct, Yuval?
That's one possibility. I mean, you can never, history is extremely surprising.
Yeah, no, I know.
You can never predict the outcome.
You can't unspool one thread from the tapestry. Let's go to some of the concerns you have about AI. I want to go through some of the concerns very quickly, and then I want to go through your philosophy of how these algorithms should be structured. But very briefly, in just a word or two, explain why modern AI might destroy democracy.
Ooh. Very briefly. Well, very briefly, democracy is a conversation. Dictatorship is one person dictating everything. That's dictatorship. Democracy is when a group of people have a conversation in order to decide what to do about any major question. Now, to have a conversation is not an easy thing. And there are technical difficulties. If you have 20 people trying to have a conversation, so they can all gather in a room and talk with each other. But how can 20 million people have a conversation? You need some kind of technology in order to do that. Now, until the modern age, there was just no technology to facilitate large-scale conversations, which is why there were no large-scale democracies anywhere in the world. The only examples we have of ancient democracies, they are all small-scale. They are city-states like Athens or Republican Rome, just one city, or they are even smaller, tribes and bands and villages. We have many examples of these small-scale democracies, not a single example of a large-scale democracy in the ancient world. All large-scale polities are authoritarian. We begin to see large-scale democracies only after the rise of modern information technology. The first crucial technology is the newspaper, and then we have the telegraph, and the radio, and the television, and suddenly it becomes feasible. There are other conditions that have to be met. It doesn't guarantee democracy, just that you have a newspaper. You have newspapers and radio also in the Soviet Union. But it becomes possible for the first time in history to have large-scale democracies. And it's important to understand that because it means that information technology is not a side dish, that you have democracy, and on the side you have all these issues with information technology. No, information technology is the basis of democracy. Democracy is built on top of this technology. So any major change in information technology is likely to cause an earthquake in democracy, which is built on top of it. And this is what we are now seeing all over the world. What we are seeing all over the world is the collapse of the democratic conversation. We have the most sophisticated information technology in human history, and people are losing the ability to talk with each other, and even more so, to listen to each other. And in every country where this is happening, there are these unique explanations of what is happening in our country. Why can't Democrats and Republicans in the US have a conversation anymore? And you go to Israel, to my country, you hear the unique explanation of what is wrong with Israel. And then you go to Brazil, and then you have the unique explanations of what's wrong with Brazilian society. But you see, the same thing is happening everywhere. The conversation is collapsing. And this is not because of some special feature in the history or society or economy of the country. It's a universal earthquake which results from the rise of this new information technology that originally the developers of the technology promised to us that it will spread the truth and bring tyrannies down and strengthen democracies, but it is doing the opposite. And very briefly, one way to visualize what is happening is imagine that democracy is a group of humans standing and having a conversation, and suddenly a group of robots enter the circle and start talking very loudly, very persuasively, very emotionally, and we can't tell who is a human and who is a robot. This is what has been happening over the last 10, 15 years, and the result is that the conversation is breaking down. And again, this is not a uniquely American phenomenon. It is happening all over the world, leading more and more to the rise of dictatorships, because dictatorships don't need conversations. Again, there is one person dictating everything.
Well, let's push on that assumption for a second. So I could have a different metaphor, which is not a bunch of robots enter the conversation, but a bunch of infinitely intelligent aides join me, and they help me sort through the conversation, and they help me prepare for what I'm going to ask. And then not only that, if you look at the last year, obviously Venezuela, tragic example, but we had, elections are not the same as democracy, but we'll use them as a proxy for this hypothetical. We had reasonably positive elections, if you're in favor of democracy, in Poland. We had a little bit of progress in Turkey, serious progress in India, in fact, where an illiberal democracy has actually been challenged We had an extremely smooth election leading to the election of a Jewish woman in Mexico. We had extremely swift and effective, no deepfakes, maybe don't like the outcome of the election in France. Similar election in the United Kingdom. I mean, the world's doing all right on these elections despite the challenges of social media, AI, everything else.
And it's not that it's already a done deal. It's not that democracy has collapsed. But if you look at the health of democracies today compared to 10 years ago or 15 years ago, at least the momentum is very worrying. And again, it's not, I don't think, what really surprises me when I look at the examples from around the world is that it's not about some huge ideological gaps. Actually, the ideological gaps between the different camps today in a place like the US are much smaller than 50 years ago. What worries is the kind of temperature of the argument, and again, this inability to have a reasoned debate, to have a reasoned conversation. Simply having elections is important, but it is not enough. Elections are not democracy. And even in some of the examples you mentioned, so it's not about who wins, which 51% win in the end. It's about the relation between the 51% and the 49%. And democracy shouldn't feel like every election is a life and death struggle, that if we lose this, it might collapse. And even more so, it shouldn't feel like a war between enemies. If a country reaches a situation when people view their political rivals as enemies, then democracy cannot survive for long, because then every election, again, it's like a war. You do anything to win. If you lose, you have no incentive to accept the verdict. If you win, you only take care of your tribe. What is happening in this situation, that a nation breaks down into tribes, leading eventually either to tribal warfare and civil war or to dictatorship. I think that the key thing here also has to do not just with democracy, but also with nationalism and with the breakdown of national communities. That many people think that democracy and nationalism, or democracy and patriotism, are somehow opposites, but they go together, they must go together. Democracy functions well only when there is a national community, only when you feel that you really care about the other people in your country and that they really care about you. If a nation reaches a point when there is no longer a nation, there are warring tribes, and each tribe cares only about itself, then it's only a question of time before democracy collapses. And this is really the worrying trend that we see in many places around the world, irrespective of the results of the latest elections here or there. And this, again, it goes back to the type of communication between people. Can we, for instance, listen to people with different views from our own without thinking that they are enemies?
I learned in the green room that one of the ways that Yuval avoids arguing with bots on Twitter is that he, as he says, is he's stuck in the 90s and uses email and the telephone. Let me ask you a question then. All right, so we're headed into this age. I will certainly agree that democracy is at risk, and I will certainly agree it is at risk for the reasons you give, and I will certainly agree that we will soon have extremely powerful AI algorithms that will underlie a lot of the decisions we make and a lot of the thinking that goes on in our own heads. In a very important section in the book, you lay out 4 values that you think should be embedded in AI systems, and they are benevolence, right? AI systems should be benevolent, seems reasonable. Decentralized, mutuality, you should understand about it, what it understands about you, and the ability to evolve, much as you said about the US Constitution versus the 10 Commandments. So a question for you, what happens when some of these come into conflict with each other, right? So when I read that section, I thought, well, benevolence kind of is in tension with decentralization, because if you decentralize these algorithms, then suddenly you have all kinds of algorithms. You have all kinds of options. You have all kinds of different companies, some of which will be benevolent as you define it, some will not be benevolent as you define it. Well, how is one supposed to weigh these 4 principles for designing future AI systems? Because weighing them correctly seems pretty important to getting the world you want.
Yeah, with benevolence, I mean something very, very narrow, and something we've known for centuries. Simply that if you get hold of my information, you should use it for my benefit and not in order to manipulate me, which is a basic principle that we already have with our doctors and our lawyers and our accountants and our therapists, and it should be no different with the people who provide us with digital services like social media or like email. Like my personal physician...
But pause for a second. Facebook would not have said it's manipulating us even when in the sort of the heyday of its algorithm. It would have said it's giving us what we want.
That's one way of putting it. And the Facebook algorithm has enormous power over us. And Facebook's business model, and the business model of most of these social media companies, it is based on increasing user engagement. And engagement sounds like a nice thing, but who doesn't want to be engaged? But for them, for the companies, it means that we need to spend more time on the platform, because the more time I spend on it, the more money they make, either by showing me advertisements and commercials or by collecting my data and then giving it or selling it to third parties. And whether this is what I want or not, that's a very big question. Do I really want to spend more and more time on the platform? Now, what their algorithms do is, by trial and error, they find my weaknesses. And they use my weaknesses to keep me glued to the screen for longer. This is the basic idea of hacking. How do you hack a smartphone or a computer or a program? You look for the weaknesses in the code. It's the same with human beings. This is how you hack human beings. You use these algorithms to find the weaknesses in our code. Each person with their own weaknesses. It's not one size fits all. What makes me angry? What do I already hate? What do I already fear? Or what I'm greedy for? And they give me more and more and more of that. It's like, the food companies that learn that if you pump something full of sugar and fat and salt, people would want more of it. Now, is it really good for us or not? Again, there is a question here. It's not an easy thing to solve, but this is the key of the dilemma, the key of the discussion. And again, the main message is that ultimately it should not be about the profits of the corporation, but whether consuming all this information is really good for me or not. And one last point, I think, like in the example of food, we've reached a point when I think most people need an information diet. That this simplistic idea that more information is always good for us is simply wrong, the same way that more food is not always good for us.
Well, that's why everybody should subscribe to The Atlantic. Let me give you a thought experiment. Because part of what I think is going to, for your system to come down and to work, it's going to depend a little bit on who defines benevolence and who defines these values. And so I want to give you a thought experiment from a conversation I had at a bar not long ago. So I met somebody. I'm going to change some of the details because I can't reveal who they are and what exactly they do. But it was an engineer who works in AI, and they make algorithms. And their current job is that they work for the state of Texas, and they're in charge of the sentencing algorithm. And so they're in charge of an AI algorithm that will determine how long somebody who's guilty will be sent to prison. And so they have hard tasks, right? They have to make sure any algorithm that is trained on historical data will have the biases of that historical data. So you train a sentencing algorithm on historic Texas data, it will be racist, so you have to control for that. You may let the women out sooner, you have to make sure that's proper and right. And you go back through and you control through it and you try to fix that. And so we're having a long conversation, and I'm asking her, well, how do you control for this, and how do you control for that, and how do you control for this? And eventually she says, you know what I do, Nick? She said, I've rigged the algorithm. And I've rigged it in such a way that everybody will be sentenced for much less time. than the state of Texas did before. And I've done it in such a way the state of Texas will never figure out that I've done that. Is that something that an AI engineer should be doing?
That's extremely dangerous. Because
extremely dangerous, but it may be a value that many liberals agree with, and they feel like conservative states have sentenced people for too long. So it's embedding a value that that person feels is benevolent into a system and leading to what they believe is justice.
At the very least, when we are talking about, the law of a country, this should be left to the citizens and to the voters,
well, it has
and not to the, a dictatorship of an engineer.
Well, they've given the power to hire whatever contractor they want to the state. They've elected, the governor of the state of Texas, and they've hired this person. The state is not Texas where this is happening, so don't Google sentencing algorithm. It's a different thing in a different place. You won't be able to figure it out, but it's the same example.
I think that the key point that is raised by this example is the issue of unfathomability. To what extent we can still understand the systems that control our lives.
Yeah.
When I get this question a lot of what really frightens me about AI. And you have these kind of Hollywood science fiction scenarios of the big robot rebellion, and the robots are rebelling and coming to kill us, and this is unlikely to happen anytime soon. But what is already happening, this is not a science fiction scenario for the future. What is already happening is that we basically have millions of AI bureaucrats, millions of bureaucratic algorithms making more and more decisions about our life. We apply to a bank to get a loan, it's an AI deciding. We committed a crime, they send us to prison, it's increasingly an AI deciding for how long. And this could rise to the level of key economic and financial decisions about what would be the rate of interest of the Federal Reserve. This could increasingly be a decision made by AIs and not human beings. And there are many good reasons why to give this kind of power to AIs. But what happened down the road when eventually so many of these crucial decisions about us are made in a way that we simply cannot understand. We don't know why the bank refused us a loan. We don't know why they sent us to 5 years and not 4 years or 6 years in prison. We don't know why the interest rate is 4% and not 3%. And we don't know, not because somebody's hiding it from us, simply because it's far too complicated for the human brain. That the advantage of AI, the good side of AI, that it can analyze much more data than any human brain, find patterns that we can't, deal with mathematical complexities which are way beyond what we can deal with. But the downside of all that is what is the meaning, for instance, of democracy? If increasingly all the decisions, or at least many of the decisions, are made in a way which are not transparent and therefore not accountable to human beings.
Let's go through another one, which is somewhat similar. So one of the companies that makes AI systems is Anthropic. And they use this system called constitutional AI as they choose how they write their prompts and how they structure their algorithm, which is probably the closest of the major AI companies to, as I understand it, the philosophy of Yuval Harari. And so when it gives an answer, it checks whether the answer would abide by the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right? It actually follows like the US Constitution, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and Apple's terms of service. It's very funny. But in any event, the biggest problem that they have and the other AI companies is they don't know, just as you said, they don't know why things make decisions. And so they've been trying to understand what's called interpretability. And so they went in and they said, well, let's see what happens if we go into all of our training data and we add a little extra weight to everything that has to do with the Golden Gate Bridge. So if there's a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, we'll weigh it double. If there's a mention of the Golden Gate Bridge, we'll weigh it double. If there's a box score about the San Francisco Giants, we'll weigh that a little more than one about the Philadelphia Phillies. They do all that, and then they ask Claude, tell me a love story. And naturally, the love story takes place on the Golden Gate Bridge, right? If you mess with the training data and the weights, you get some of these interesting outcomes. So then the question for you would be, if we can do this, Why not go into the AI and not weight it towards the Golden Gate Bridge, but weight it towards love, compassion, benevolence? Is that a good idea?
I'm not sure what it means in a technical sense, but when I look at human history, I know that quite often in history, people talk about love, or they start with love, and very quickly they get to hate and to war. The Christianity, which sees itself, and going back to the Council of Carthage, sees itself as the religion of love, that it's all about love, was responsible for more violence than any other religion or ideology in history. And they somehow found a way how, out of love, we wage crusades, and we build inquisitions, and we burn heretics at the stake. It's all out of love. And they really believed it.
They also gave us Bach.
But again, the way that I think this often happens is that if you think that you are motivated by love, and if you think that you're trying to build utopia, whoever stands in your way must be demonic. Whoever stands in your way must be evil. The more good I am, then any opposition is by definition, it's not just somebody who thinks differently, but they are evil. Now again, I'm not sure how to translate that into AI speak, but again, one of the lessons from history is that just thinking that because we have these kind of good weights, we've weighted our holy book, we've weighted the code in favor of love. Anything that has love, it got extra. Anything that has compassion, it got extra. And somehow from that you get the Inquisition. So if it happens with humans, I would also be very worried about AI. But what we need, the basic thing that, again, we learn again and again in history is that we need a self-correcting mechanism. We can't trust that just because something has these good values at its basis, what will come out of it will also necessarily be benevolent and compassionate. We saw it again in the modern age with Marxism, which begins with these wonderful ideas of equality and of compassion, and ends with the gulags. And if you're really convinced that you're coming from a good foundation, and also if you think that you're in the process of building utopia, then it gives you an open check to do the most horrible things on the way to utopia. And again, anything that stands in your way is then transformed from political rivalry to kind of demonic possession.
I mean, in some ways, this is one of the scariest things you said, because the people who are building the AI models genuinely do believe they're leading us to utopia, right?
And that's very, very dangerous, because this is what gives them the open check. They say, we are building utopia, so anything that kind of we have to sacrifice on the way is worth it, because when you would look at the bottom line, and this was the basic argument also of people like Lenin and Stalin. Yes, we have to murder these millions of people, but in the end, when we build utopia, real existing socialism here on Earth, it will turn out that it's, these billions who died in the Gulag, this was worth it.
Man, I had never thought of the Khmer Rouge at the same time I thought of Anthropic, but here we are. But hold on, Yuval. In the next couple weeks, I think, where were you last? You were last in Toronto. You're probably going to move west, and you're probably going to sit down, and you're going to sit down with all these people because they all read your books, right? There's this famous image of Jeff Bezos, and he's giving this interview, and he's got like 4 books behind him on his bookshelf, and like plants, and and 3 of them are Yuval's, I believe. So you're going to be talking to these folks, and so what you're telling me is that if, say, Dario Modi, the guy who runs Anthropic, is there, he's like, we're trying to figure out what to train on, and I've been thinking we should train it on, we should just train it on sort of positive, uplifting, factual stories. I really don't think we should, train it on everything, which includes like serial killers' diaries. And you're going to say like, no, put the serial killers' diaries in there because, don't just train it on your definition of love. Is that what you're going to argue to him?
No, I mean, I would basically say that I don't know how to train AIs. This is not my field. But no matter what kind of positive basis you give it, and no matter what positive intentions you have, your number one assumption should be that this thing is not infallible. I'm not infallible. There is a high chance for mistakes, and therefore I need to leave room for correction. The most important thing when you build it is build a mechanism for identifying and correcting the mistakes. Again, this is also the advice that I would have gave Lenin in 1917. Like, you're going on this huge experiment, you're thinking that you're building utopia, start with the assumption that you will make mistakes, include in the structure, say, of the Soviet Union, mechanisms for identifying and correcting the mistakes of the system, including the mistakes of Lenin and of whoever is going to succeed you, which is the one thing they didn't do.
Yeah, Lenin should have read *Sapiens*. I have an image of him reading it on the train there. All right, let's talk a little bit about cocoons, which is one of the extremely interesting parts of your book. So you make an argument, and you say that there are some fundamental human issues, like the separation of mind and body. You tell the story of Martin Luther. It's actually a way of telling the story of Martin Luther I had not read before. But you argue that what could happen in an age of AI is that you end up with some civilizations that have a totally different understanding of what is the mind and what is the body, and therefore totally different judicial systems. So it's one of the most mind-bending parts of the book. I'd like you to explain this to the audience.
Ooh. So there is a lot of explaining. I'll try to do it short. I mean, first of all, about the cocoons, it's the changing of the metaphors in this age of information revolution. That, 30 years ago, the dominant metaphor was the web, the World Wide Web. And the web was supposed to connect everything and everybody. And over the years, the web kind of closed in on us, and now it's the cocoons. That every person or every group is enclosed within an information cocoon, and sometimes, your next door neighbors are in a different cocoon than you, and there is just no way to access from one to the other. And an extreme example of where this can go, like today, people don't agree, like in the United States, about who won the last elections. This can go to a place where people don't agree what a human is, or what a person is, and what are the relations between mind and body. One of the recurrent arguments throughout history that we see in many traditions, in Judaism, in Christianity, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, is what exactly is a human being, and what is the relation between mind and body, or between soul and spirit and body. So if we again go back to the age of the Council of Carthage and early Christianity, so Judaism and the first Christians, which came out of Judaism, they viewed humans as embodied entities. The body was central. We are bodies. The soul, biblical Judaism did not talk at all about the soul. The idea that there could be a soul that exists separately from the body, unheard of in biblical Judaism. It's all about the body. And also the first Christians, they focus on the body. The whole idea originally is that God is incarnated in the flesh. The flesh is at the center. And after Jesus is crucified, he's supposed to come back in the flesh. And the kingdom of God is supposed to be a material kingdom of fleshy bodies on the earth. But eventually, under influences of Platonic philosophies and other influences, and also for practical purposes, because the kingdom of God was nowhere to be seen, and the really big problem for early Christians is that they won. When you're a persecuted minority, a sect, you can have all these promises, okay, when we finally gain power, then we'll have the kingdom of God. And then they have one of the biggest disasters that can happen to any religion, they gain power. They become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, so where's the kingdom of God?
And there is no kingdom of God. You still have the same wars and corruptions and civil wars and executions and human greed, and it's all the same. So they say, okay, the kingdom of God is not on earth. It's on a different level of reality. It's in heaven. And you can't access it in the flesh. After you die, your soul will get to heaven. And many Christians drift towards a very different view of humans, as a dualistic view actually, that my real essence is my soul, which is entrapped in a material, biological, filthy body with all these sexual passions and all these lusts. And the hope, the ideal, is that eventually the soul will be released from this earthly, fleshy prison and get to a purely immaterial realm, which is heaven, where it will exist forever and ever. And throughout the 2,000 years of Christian history, you see this tension. They can never really abandon the body, partly because the Bible is full of it. And again, Christ was incarnated in the body, in the flesh, and rose and came back to life in the flesh. And there is very little about this immaterial realm of pure souls in the Bible itself. It all mostly came later. So there is this constant and arguments that often leads to blows and to wars of religion. And in the early century of the church, one of the biggest arguments was about the nature of Jesus Christ himself, with one camp saying that he was entirely a human, made of flesh, another camp saying that he was entirely divine and non-material, a spiritual being, and there was a third camp who said that he was non-binary. And the non-binaries won. This was the eventually official doctrine of the church. He is non-binary. He's both and none at the same time. But huge arguments and also violence around these issues. Now, how does all this relate to AI? We are going to have another round of this mind-body debate. We are already in the midst of it. What is your identity? What defines your identity? Is your identity defined by your biological body? Or is your identity defined by what you believe about yourself, by your faith? You know, people like Martin Luther, they said sola fide. The only thing that matters is what you believe. And we are now living in a kind of new round of this debate, with some people say, if you go online, you can be whatever you want. The biological body sitting in front of the screen should not limit the identities that you can adopt. Other people say, no, there is a biological body. This is the center of your identity. You cannot ignore your biological body. And as everybody knows, this is a very heated debate right now. And this also potentially will influence how we treat AIs. AIs have no bodies, but they will increasingly be able to interact with us and to press our emotional buttons and even to pretend to have emotions of themselves. Now, people who give primacy to the body in the identity of a person will resist treating AIs as persons. People who think that identity has little to do with biology will have a much easier time giving or treating AIs as persons, even though they have no bodies. And different countries can go different ways. So, you know, arguments about human rights today between, say, United States and China, think what it means in 50 years when you perhaps have billions of entities which are considered persons with rights in one country, but another country doesn't recognize them as persons at all because they have no biological body. And at least in the US, interestingly enough, there is already a completely open legal path to recognizing non-humans devoid of bodies as legal persons with rights. Because corporations, according to US law, are legal persons that has, for instance, freedom of speech, according to the Supreme Court since at least 2010. Now, at present, this is a legal fiction, because all the decisions of corporations are made by human beings with biological bodies. So Google, according to US law, is a legal person, but at present, all the decisions of Google have to be made by some human being. But what happens in a few years maybe when you start incorporating AIs as legal persons? You can technically incorporate an AI as a corporation, let's call it Google. And the interesting thing about Google is that it doesn't need any human employees to make its decisions for it. This is what the AI can do it by itself. So the AI, for instance, can open a bank account and can start earning money. It can go on TaskRabbit or Mechanical Turk online and offer its services to people or corporations and earn money, and then it has money. And then it can start investing its money in the stock exchange. And if it's a very intelligent AI, it could potentially become the richest person in the US. So think about a situation when the richest person in the US is not a human being. It's an AI. And again, according to US law, as far as I understand, one of the rights reserved for this non-human person is freedom of speech, which manifests itself, among other things, in making political contributions. So this AI could donate billions of dollars to politicians in exchange for giving even more rights to AI. So these are the kinds of science fiction scenarios I think that we should be more concerned with than the Great Robot Rebellion.
If a senior AI bot starts to hit on a junior AI bot in this corporation, what should the AI HR department... Okay. We have a bunch of flesh and blood bodies here who have to go get pizza and beer. So I'm going to ask just one more question about the apocalypse, and then we're going to go to audience questions. So I was reading your book on the subway. I was wrapping it up before dinner the other night with my son, and this was my favorite paragraph. I'm just going to read it to you, and I want you to explain what it means. We have now created a non-conscious, but very powerful alien intelligence. Agreed. If we mishandle it, AI might extinguish not only the human dominion on Earth, but the light of consciousness itself, turning the universe into a realm of utter darkness. Very cheerful book here, Yuval. This is the end. It is our responsibility to prevent this. So one way to prevent it would be to prevent AI from extinguishing us. Another would be to try to create consciousness and send it out into the universe. Explain to me, the question that this paragraph raises is, what is the thing that humans could do that would allow consciousness to exist even if we extinguish ourselves?
Oh, I'm not sure what it is. I mean, the problem is we still don't understand consciousness. We don't know how it emerges in us. We don't know how it evolved. That's why we also, with regard to AI, this big question of AI consciousness, I tend to be agnostic about it. I don't think that AIs will necessarily develop consciousness, but I'm not sure that they will never develop consciousness. Could be. So again, this scenario that AIs destroy human civilization, take over, and maybe spread from Earth to the rest of the galaxy and to other galaxies, but in the process they never develop consciousness. This is the dark universe scenario. That, again, that there is huge confusion about these two terms because in humans they go together. Intelligence is the ability to attain goals and solve problems on the way to that goal. Consciousness is the ability to feel things like pain and pleasure and love and hate. humans solve problems relying on our feelings. In us and in other mammals and animals, consciousness and intelligence go together. This is why we confuse them. Now, in computers, so far, we have only seen an advance, a huge advance in intelligence, without any advance in consciousness as far as we can tell. In some fields, narrow fields, AI is already far more intelligent than us, and still it has no consciousness. When it wins the game of chess, it's not happy. When it loses, it's not sad. It doesn't feel anything. Now, in many scenarios, as AI becomes more and more intelligent, at some point, it also gains consciousness. But there is no reason to think that this is inevitable. There could be different roads leading to super intelligence. Mammals and humans have been traveling along one road for millions and millions of years, a road which involves the development of consciousness. Computers, AIs, might simply be traveling along a different road, a much faster road, which reaches superintelligence without passing through any phase of developing consciousness. And if this happens, and if it gets out of our control, this could spell, again, not just the end of the human dominion on Earth, but the end of the light of consciousness itself. You can have a galactic empire without any feeling, and nothing feels anything. It's just all dark.
But why is that? Explain to me why that is so much a worse outcome than just the obliteration of humans, which is a plenty bad outcome.
There are other entities, conscious entities in the world right now. There are other animals. There is no reason to think that, in the history of billions of years of life, that sapiens is definitely the last station. Whether through biological evolution or whether through some kind of combination with AI, it's very likely that if we survive, I don't think that humans like us will still be here in 1,000 years or 10,000 years. The technology will be so advanced that there will be sentient beings, but they will have completely different bodies and minds, completely different experiences. And this is not necessarily bad. The same way that, the fact that we are here and the first human species that existed 2 million years ago are gone, we don't think about it as a tragedy. And most people, at least with regard to their children, they hope that their children will be, at least in some way, a bit more evolved than them. But to think that this will be completely wiped out, that there will still be intelligence, but no consciousness at all. I think that intelligence is really overrated. The really important thing in life is consciousness. It's not intelligence. Intelligence enables us to do different things, but ultimately, it's all about consciousness.
You know who's still going to be there, Yuval? These guys. Pigeons are going to be there, and they're going to speak thousands of languages. All right, let's go to some audience questions. In your last book, this is from Martin Gallardo, in Homo Deus, you began your book by arguing that humanity has, quote, has almost defeated, quote, hunger, plagues, and war. Do you still stand for that idea, or have you reconsidered your argument?
I think humanity has the capacity to rein in famine, plague, and war, but it depends whether we actually do it, depends on our decisions, and we have been making some terrible decisions over the last 10 years, which is why we are seeing the return of these calamities, of these conditions. We are now on the verge of a third world war, which, if it happens, is also likely to be accompanied by famine and potentially by plague. And the key thing to understand is that the decline, for instance, of war in recent generations was not the result of a change in the laws of nature. It was not some divine miracle. It was simply humans making good decisions and building good institutions. And if we start making bad decisions and neglecting the institutions that preserved peace, then war returns.
This question is from Hamad Alavi. There is growing concern regarding the impact of AI on employment, particularly for low-skilled jobs and low-income communities. Considering the rapid advancements and uncertainties associated with AI, what strategies or measures can be implemented to alleviate these negative effects?
The safest thing is to slow down. I think that humans and human societies are extremely adaptable, but in order to adapt, you need time. So, you know, if 10% or 20% of people suddenly lose their jobs, this is a huge political crisis. If it's kind of more drawn out over several years, we have time to adapt. And the most important thing is what happens on the global level. Because when I look at the country like the United States, for instance, I'm not so worried. I mean, you know, many jobs will disappear in the coming decade or two. Other jobs will emerge. The big question is whether people will be able to retrain themselves to fill the new jobs. And for that, they will need support. And the countries that lead the AI revolution, they will have immense resources to support the retraining of the population and also to support those members of society that will not be able to go through the transition. The big problem will be in other countries that might face complete economic collapse and will just not have the resources to retrain their workforce and to adapt to the new AI economy.
What do you think of the premise of the question that AI will affect employment, particularly for low-skilled jobs in low-income communities? People argue both sides of that.
I'm not sure. There are good reasons to think it will definitely impact also kind of high-income jobs, accountants, lawyers, doctors, coders, engineers. There is no reason to think that it will focus specifically on low-income jobs.
I think it's probably going to wipe out media CEOs and historians first. This is from Mike Sexton. My favorite thing about your historical writing is that it has implications not just for how we live, but how we should live. If you were a lifestyle guru instead, what message or recommendations would you have for your audience?
I'm not a lifestyle guru, so I don't know.
As most of you know, this man meditates 2 hours a day, takes a month-long retreat. You are a lifestyle guru.
Yeah, but I don't tell all people to do it. I know that, you know, it works for me, but I know it doesn't work for other people. You know, if for somebody else, it's better to, you know, take a hike in the woods, so do that instead. The idea that, you know, meditation works for me, so it must work for all people, it's not.
Yeah, I tried a month-long silent retreat and didn't work for my employees and my 3 kids. How do you think AI and disinformation will impact minority rights, especially for those in the LGBTQ+ community?
Ooh. Again, it depends on our decisions. It's not deterministic. It can work both ways. For my own life, I know that, you know, the internet and social media has been wonderful in many ways to the LGBTQ community. I met my husband 22 years ago in one of the first social media websites for gay people in Israel, which was, again, it was really a revolution. Because if you think about minorities in history, there are 2 types of minorities. You have concentrated minorities and you have dispersed minorities. And concentrated minorities, you think like, you know, Jewish communities. So if you're born a Jew, let's say in Europe in the Middle Ages, then there aren't many Jews around, but you're surrounded by them. You're born into a Jewish family, in a Jewish neighborhood, in a Jewish ghetto, in a Jewish community, you know lots of Jews. So you have no problem finding other Jews. But for instance, I was born in Israel in the 1970s. I grew up in the 80s and 90s in a very homophobic society. And I wasn't born in Tel Aviv. I was born in a small suburb of Haifa. And I didn't know anybody who was gay. And this is a dispersed minority. Most gay boys are not born to a gay family in a gay community. Sometimes it happens, but it's very rare. So the first question you encounter is, how do I find the others? Again, a question that Jews don't have to deal with, but gay people had to deal with throughout history. And then the internet came along. And to a large extent solved the problem.
that suddenly it became very easy, or at least much easier than before, to find each other. So, I often criticize, and in the book there is a lot of criticism of information technology and social media, but they also have enormous positive potential.
Could extinguish the light of the universe, but good for the gays. All right. Thank you. If you could resurrect one other species of human that is now extinct, which one would you bring back and for what purpose?
I think it will be very bad for them. I mean, the way that our species treat ourselves, just because we have a little bit of different language or skin color, I wouldn't like to be a Neanderthal minority or the niece of a minority in a sapiens world.
Should AI be raised with human parents along a curated, this is from Kathleen Landers, along a curated developmental trajectory to create a sense of love and attachment and connection on the assumption that it's possible to instill a moral code in the way one is created by humans, we should try?
AIs are not organic. I mean, they function along a completely different, in completely different ways. They are not, I don't know, chimpanzees or Neanderthals that you can think, okay, I'll raise a chimpanzee in a human family so it will become human-like. And this is a key kind of misconception we often have about AI. Like you have all these people asking, when will AI reach human-level intelligence? The answer is never. It's not on the path to human-level intelligence. It's not human, it's not even organic. I mean, for me, the acronym AI traditionally stood for artificial intelligence. I think it should stand for alien intelligence. Alien not in the sense of coming from outer space, alien in the sense that, yes, this is intelligence, but it makes decisions, it processes information, it invents ideas in a fundamentally alien way. Again, it's not organic. One thing, just one very important thing is that organic beings, we work by cycles. Day and night, winter and summer, growth and decay, and sometimes we're active, sometimes we need to rest. One of the problems we encounter more and more in the world is that now the world is increasingly run by these non-organic intelligences that never need to rest, and they don't have cycles, and they pressure us to be the same. Instead of them becoming like us, they pressure us to be the same. And if you force an organic being to be on all the time, to be active all the time, eventually it just collapses and dies. You think even about something like the financial system. So traditionally, the financial system is an organic system which sometimes take breaks. Wall Street the market is open only, I think, Monday to Friday, 9:30 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that's it. Weekend, it's off. Christmas, it's off. And this is good for human beings. But if you give AIs greater control of finance, then the system is always on, and this puts pressure on human financiers and bankers to be always on, which is just humanly impossible. And the same thing is happening to journalists, and the same thing is happening to politicians, which consequently collapse. And I often say that the most misunderstood word in the English language, at least in the United States, is the word excited. That people overuse it as a good thing. Like they meet you and they say, oh, I'm so excited to meet you. You publish a book, oh, this is so exciting. And they think that excited means happy, but it doesn't. Excited means that like your nervous system and your brain is fully on. And if you could keep the nervous system of an organic entity on all the time, it leads to collapse. So the whole system is far too excited. We need to relax. Like we meet each other, I'm so relaxed to be here with you today. And not excited at all. And just think how good it would be if politics was less exciting. Like, what we need, I think above all in politics is boring politicians. Like I would say, vote for boring politicians.
All right, well, I am so relaxed to ask the very last question of the night, Yuval. This is from Misha. Do you think that future reliance on artificial intelligence will impact and compete with religion as a source of spirituality?
Could be, quite likely. I think that, many religions have always fantasized about having access to a superhuman intelligence. And suddenly we have it. Think about texts, about holy texts. The idea of the holy text is that this is coming from a non-human intelligence which is superior to us. Now, the problem with holy texts throughout human history until today was that they couldn't really talk back to us. Like, there was something in the text we couldn't understand, and the text could not explain itself. Like, what is the correct interpretation of this passage in Scripture? So you always, even though in theory the highest authority in the religion was the holy text, in practice a human institution grew around the holy text, and the real authority was in the hands of the people who interpreted the text. And the same way that you have today this fight in the tech world between people who believe in open source and people who believe that no, it should be closed and just a couple of experts will. This was the same with Catholics and Protestants. Like the Catholics say, no, you have the experts of the church, they should interpret the Holy Code. And you have the Protestants who believe in open source. Anybody can read the code and interpret it by themselves. But what happens when for the first time in history the text can talk back? Whether the text of the traditional holy books, you can train an AI to read every single treatise written by every theologian or bishop or thinker in the 3rd century or in 11th century Byzantium, and that AI will understand the texts of Christianity better than any human being. Would it be more authoritative than human theologians and bishops? One big question. The other question, what happens if you have new religions with texts written by a non-human intelligence? And this can already happening right now. With AIs maybe disseminating a new holy text online, which creates the kernel for the next big religion, which will have, again, a text that can talk back, coming from a superhuman, non-human intelligence. So I definitely think that some of the most interesting developments in AI will be in the field of theology and religion. And maybe it's and with a recommendation that Google and Microsoft, they should hire a few theologians because they will need it.
All right, that is the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much to Politics and Prose. Thank you so much to the theater. And thank you most of all to Yuval Noah Harari.